Welcome to Perspective and Potential, where we explore thoughtful ways to navigate life, strengthen families, and grow into who we're becoming. I'm Abigail Strait, joined by my co-host and mother, Gwen Fund. Together, we explore ideas and stories through honest conversations about personal growth, faith, and the everyday choices that shape our lives. Inviting you to grow, shift your perspective, and step more fully into who you're becoming. If you'd like to learn more about us, you can check us out at perspectiveandpotential.com. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in and see where a new perspective might take you. In this episode, we're stepping into a familiar but uncomfortable space. The space between what feels safe and what God is asking us to become. In Genesis chapters 12 through 17, we read about Abraham being asked to leave what he knows, his land, his security, his sense of predictability, without being given a detailed explanation of how everything would unfold. What he's offered instead is a promise, a direction, and an invitation to trust. And while most of us aren't being asked to physically leave our homes, the pattern feels familiar. God's call often requires movement away from what feels comfortable before clarity fully arrives. It stretches our faith, it challenges our assumption, and exposes the places where comfort has quietly become our anchor. Because comfort isn't always about ease. Sometimes it's about familiarity. Sometimes it's about control, or about simply staying where we don't have to risk being uncertain. Which leads us to this important question. What comforts are hardest for people to release?
Oh, well, that is a loaded question because a lot of it depends on a person's personality and their background. Um, Control is a big one, but that's often a problem for people who have experienced trauma in their life or abandonment. And sometimes it's also a trait for somebody who just happens to have a red, aggressive personality type. Income. A lot of us, put our faith and trust in having enough finances. So it's really difficult for somebody who suffered some kind of deprivation or maybe even bullying because of the way they dress. They don't have the right clothes. Um, Reputation. Oh, and in many cultures or families, there is a deep root of this honor, right? And so to have those roots, um, can lead to a lot of trial and tribulation for us, having our reputation at risk. Or it can be the result of just being a very self-focused personality type. Routine, that goes right along with control. They fit together many times. If someone needs control in their life, many times they accomplish that through these very familiar and rigid routines. And so if the routine gets threatened, then, that's really difficult. Also, kids with autism or some other problems like that, they need that steadiness to know what's coming next. Relationships are also extremely important to people who get their personal value from those relationships. I mean, there's codependent personalities out there who only feel whole when somebody needs them. So that's exactly why counseling can be so difficult because we're all so different in our personalities, in our backgrounds, and even right down to our desires. So I have this little sign in my office that I really love, and it says, "You'll never leave where you are until you decide where you'd rather be." So deciding is really the first step in any growth journey. that we're trying to take. But too many times I've worked with people who wanted other people to change so that their life would be better. But you could waste your whole life waiting for that to happen. What most people don't want to believe is that the world around us changes as we change. The way we treat each other, the way we talk to each other, we can either create chaos or peace. So in Matthew 23, verses 25 and 26, Christ chastises the Pharisees for not cleansing the inner vessel. And I found that to be a very beneficial concept for individual growth and happiness. If we start with ourselves and try to understand how our own behavior is adding to the problems in our life, then we can course correct and see how many of our woes disappear just like that. So it's kind of like the story of Mr. Scrooge, right? Until he did that introspection with all the ghosts, his life didn't change. But once he figured out some things that behaviors he needed to change, it changed his life. So the story of Abraham in the Old Testament is also a good study of this concept in our personal lives. So rather than trying to fit in with a culture and a belief system that he did not share, he endured the hardships of venturing out into an unknown where he could be free to serve the God that he loved. And many times, it's us. We have to be the one to make that first move.
Well, and it's interesting because I think the very concept of comfort is actually more personal to each of us than we may realize, right? What one person struggles to let go of might not even register for someone else. And most of the time, it's not the thing itself that's hard to release, but it's what that thing provides. And you shared some of these in your, examples, but like someone might believe they're holding on to a plan, right? But what they're actually holding on to is this perceived control. That plan gives them a sense of certainty. Releasing it means trusting that the next step will be revealed after they move, not necessarily before. So, comfort gives us this sense of control or predictability or security. Or sometimes it's just that way to avoid uncertainty, which we don't seem to like very much. And that's why I think change can feel threatening. And I think we're all very familiar that people just in general struggle with change because letting go of comfort usually means that we have to step into something that we don't fully understand yet. We also may have to accept responsibility for our own growth instead of waiting for, like you said, our circumstances or other people to shift first. That is just, so common to just want everybody else to change around us. And here's what I've come to know that real change does, like you said, it starts with that internal decision. Before anything external looks different, something internal has to shift. Our perspective, our ownership, and definitely our willingness. You can do a lot with willingness, but if you don't have that willingness, it's going to be hard for things to change. But once that shift happens, right, then things around us kind of start to change, like you said, and I think that's what makes Abraham's story so relevant. God didn't give him the full picture. He didn't lay out a timeline and said, here's what's going to happen in 1 year, 2 years, or the outcome. And, how many of us are developing that 5-year plan and when things don't go according to that plan, it's like, is the whole 5 years ruined? No, but, we just have to be willing to align. And God asked Abraham to move and then to just trust that that understanding would come along the way. And it's funny how many times we have to learn this lesson in life, but that understanding, if you look back in those experiences, I believe if we're being honest with ourselves, we realize that that understanding did come. So here's the question that I think we have to answer for ourselves. How much clarity do we usually want before we're willing to move?
Oh, that is a good question. Yeah, and like you said, some people want absolute proof before they're willing to take a risk to make a change in their life. Through our daily habits, we are all becoming something. So to become anything is a deliberate, ongoing, and active process. Unless we're actively and intentionally oriented on future growth, we'll just become stuck. And that is not conducive to our personal happiness. We can get stuck in things like fear. We can get stuck in boredom, anger, and even indifference. But the end result is always disappointment and unhappiness.
So, if we know that that's not what we want, we don't want that disappointment and unhappiness, and we have this willingness inside of us. What does faith look like then? What does faith look like inside of us when the destination is unclear?
Well, faith is a simple but complex word. So we do think of it as a noun, something that we can attain. But the very word denotes action because we actually have to put that faith in many things. Sometimes we put it in our own abilities. Sometimes we put it in the loving relationships that we have. And many times, hopefully, we put it in God because faith isn't really faith until you do something with it. But faith is also a superpower. It has the power to move us forward in the face of adversity. It can give us courage and resilience, and it can give us comfort when we feel let down or we're feeling kind of small. So, people who possess faith generally end up with better mental health, better self confidence, better satisfaction with their life. Faith is really the thing that keeps us moving forward, and it can take us into those unknowns with relative confidence, that everything's going to be okay. So, as we reflect on Abraham's story, that we can see the growth that he experienced through his journey of faith. And we see the blessings that he received as a result of his willingness to do the hard thing and to take that journey into the unknown.
Well, so here's what I take from that. That faith isn't passive. And I mean that it shows up, like you said, in those very real choices. It shows up in whether we move or we stay still, even when we don't know exactly how things are going to turn out. And so with Abraham, what stands out is that his situation didn't change first. Okay, we've been saying this. He didn't receive the information, the clarity, security. What changed first was his willingness to just trust God enough to take the next step. And I bet if we look back and we think about these instances in our own life, we'll recognize that God seems to spend time working on us before he works on what's around us. So, I mean, think about that. Think about those times in our lives where, we've had faith. And I think what we tend to do is we tend to project and look forward to, oh, yep, I had faith, I prayed, and we kind of skip the internal part and go to that reward or what happened as a result. But if we really, really dissect it and we just pay attention to maybe our train of thought, we'll realize that if we let him and invite him, he influences our thoughts, how we respond, how we see ourselves, how we see our capabilities. Um, and then it's only later that the circumstances begin to shift. So let's think about this then. Why does God often work on who we are becoming before he changes what's happening around us?
Because I'm sure he knows not only what is happening around us right now, but he knows what's going to be happening in our future. He knows also our strengths and attributes that we're going to have to navigate not only these trials, but the future ones as well. And like any loving parent, he wants us to develop our inner reserves so that we can better navigate all the storms of life that will come at us. In Doctrine and Covenants, it says, if you're prepared, you shall not fear. So Ezra Taft Benson gave a wonderful talk about this very subject. It was called Born of God, and he gave it at a conference way back in 1987. It's important to note that even though he was prophet of the LDS Church, he had also worked in the affairs of government as the Secretary of Agriculture under United States President Eisenhower. So in this particular talk, he says, the Lord works from the inside out. The world works from the outside in. The world would take people out of the slums. Christ takes the slums out of people, and then they take themselves out of the slums. The world would mold men by changing their environment. Christ changes men who then change their environment. The world would shape human behavior, but Christ can change human nature. Those are all very important truths. We can take people and relocate them to beautiful environments, but if they don't adjust their inner habits, the new place will soon become just like their old place.
Speaking of the spirit of preparation and preparing ourselves before we move forward, um, I've been tracking the story of Taryn Smith. She just completed a very long journey across the Atlantic as the first American woman to complete a solo row across the Atlantic, which was 3,000 miles. And she kept a video diary of the journey. Every single day she would get on and share a little bit of an update on the challenges that she had to go through that day, or sometimes pleasant experiences, and those pleasant experiences gave her the hope and the motivation to continue. But what struck me most about her story wasn't actually the row itself. As I kind of dug deeper, I learned about everything that had to happen long before she ever touched the ocean. And she didn't grow up rowing. She didn't grow up um on the water, and she didn't grow up next to the beach. But the strength training, the mental conditioning, the time she had to spend preparing for isolation, exhaustion, unpredictability, none of that preparation was visible once the race started. But it is what made it possible for her to keep going when conditions were at their worst, when she had to row for hours straight in sheets of rain, but she had no choice. She had to keep moving forward, or the waves were going to continue to take her farther away from her destination. So you don't train in calm water and expect that's going to carry you through a storm. You prepare ahead of time, knowing that when things are going to get hard, You won't suddenly become stronger. You'll rely on what's already been built inside of you. And I think that that feels very similar to the way that God works with us. He prepares us internally, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, if we let Him, before the storms even arrive. Because when the circumstances change, it's not the environment, like you said, that keeps us steady. It's the reserves that we've developed long before we needed them. So, how often do you think does growth require becoming someone new before arriving somewhere new?
Well, unless we're acquiring new strength, new knowledge, and new faith, we're going to be ill equipped to handle new problems that are definitely going to arrive as our lives get more complicated. Yeah, this life is not a beach vacation where we lay on the sand and just soak up the sunshine. It really is just an opportunity to grow, to learn, to become more like our Father in heaven and Jesus Christ. It's a time to experience all of the emotions, the joys and the sadness that life has to offer, along with the wonders and beauties of this wonderful place in which we live. It's a quest and an adventure. God has given us the pen to write our own stories by giving us our agency. But the stage is already set, and everything is already in place. So I'm sure that he hopes that we'll all be victorious heroes when we finally lay our pens down.
I love that. And I think as we close, I think the invitation in Abraham's story is quieter than we sometimes expect. God didn't rush him. He didn't give him all the details. He simply asked him to move and to trust that the clarity would come along the way. And that same pattern shows up in our lives more often than we probably admit. Calling rarely begins with certainty. More often, it begins with a willingness to loosen our grip on what feels safe and familiar, even when we don't know what's next. Comfort can be a gift, but it can also become the very thing that keeps us from growing into what and who God is shaping us to be. So maybe the question for each of us isn't whether or not we're capable of more, but whether we're willing to leave what feels comfortable enough to discover it. And as we do, we may find that God isn't just leading us to a new place or a new season. He's patiently forming us along the way. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast, be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We'd love to hear from you. Your input helps shape the conversation and makes perspective and potential even more impactful. We're Gwen and Abby, and you've been listening to Perspective and Potential. Until next time, keep exploring new perspectives, and remember that every small change can lead to something big. Food for thought.
Bon appetit.